Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar around setting key performance indicators, identifying and measuring KPIs for practice success. Thank you very much for giving up your some time out of your busy schedule for this webinar today. My name's Anna Maria Gibb. I'm one of the presenters. I'll be speaking at the end doing a demonstration of the PracticeHub platform. But before we get started with our other two excellent speakers, just a little bit of housekeeping. You should be able to hear us speaking now. You are muted, but if you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the chat field. We'll work through them during the session, but we've also left some time at the end for any questions that we don't get to during the presentation. A link to the recording will be sent to all of you. So if you are unable to stay for the whole thing, or if you'd like to share the link or revisit our presentation, you will have a link to the recording sent to you after the webinar. So what I think I'll do is get started by introducing our speakers today. So our first speaker today is Jared Bramble. Jared is a partner at Cutcher & Neal Accountants, and Jared has over 20 years experience in accounting and financial planning. He is an inspiring presenter who regularly presents at events for a range of organisations, including the Australian Medical Association, the Australian Society of Ophthalmologists, and the Australian Association of Practice Management. He's also a regular contributor to the leading medical industry magazine, New South Wales Doctor. I personally have heard Jared speak many times and always get some really good information out of his presentations. Our other speaker today is Dr. David Williams. David is a neurologist and former lab head in neurosciences at Monash University. He is the founder and managing director of Australia's largest private neurology practice. David designed scalable, efficient administration processes central to the operation of all medical practices. Following on from the success of his neurology business, David established Hoxton Medical Practice Management, which supports more than 350 doctors each year through a range of outsourced practice management services. And finally, there's myself. I'm the co-creator of my practice manual, which is now PracticeHub. I am passionate about helping healthcare organisations run more efficiently and minimise their risk using better business management systems and processes. I have a background in practice management and qualifications in business and adult education. And just like today, I regularly present on business systems and processes. So what I would like to do now is quickly run through the agenda. So we're going to talk about what are KPIs. We're going to focus on the balanced scorecard approach. So some of you may have heard of this, but if you haven't, or even if you have, I think you'll find this is a really good way of looking at KPIs. We'll talk about how to design KPIs. And at the end, I'll talk about how PracticeHub can help you implement that balanced scorecard approach as well. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Jared Bramble. Thanks, Jared.
Thank you for the great introduction. Today, as I've been preparing, I've been really looking forward to it because you're getting the benefit of David Williams later on after me from looking from within a medical practice. And I guess at the same time, being an accountant, I'm looking from the outside of a medical practice. So putting together KPIs using a balanced scorecard is a really great way to link your business or practice strategy to the KPIs that you'd like to monitor and develop. I always like to start with a quote, and I really like this one by Sir Winston Churchill, because he who fails to plan is planning to fail. So you certainly wouldn't prepare a budget to make a loss, would you? So today is really about thinking about planning, thinking about your practice's vision and your practice's strategy, and then putting that vision and strategy into a format that you can measure and monitor as you lead the practice. So if we move to the next slide, I like this comment. And this I read right when COVID hit, right when our whole firm was moving out and we were on Zoom and they were changing the JobKeeper rules. I think they were changing them daily or hourly. And one of the things that a leader must always practice is staying calm, working to a plan, and making sure your communication is fantastic. And I had little post-it notes and I sent them around to all the managers at Cutcher and Neal to stick on their screens to remind them that when you are communicating, if you are working to a plan and staying calm, everybody else will be able to follow your leadership. And that's just as you start to implement KPIs, being able to communicate them clearly and calmly will help everyone engage in that process. So what are our KPI objectives? Next slide, please. So basically, we're looking at what KPIs that we can have inside a medical practice. And David's really going to give you some great insight into the KPIs that he uses, which I think you'll get a lot from. And then just deploying the balanced scorecard to really fine tune those 4 areas of a balanced scorecard to make sure that those KPIs really hone in on what your vision and strategy is. So to define a KPI, next slide, please. Key performance indicators are quantifiable financial and non-financial measurements. And I think that's very important because one of the examples that we'll show later on in this presentation is some non-financial measurements of KPIs, and it does reflect critical success factors of a practice. And the whole idea of a KPI is to make something complex very, very simple. And I could tell you there's one critical measure that we use in the accounting firm. It's average hourly rate. A simple measure that tells us that the success of every division based on the hours recovered per employee. And that you'll see that KPI turn up today as well. So what are some very simple KPI examples on the next slide? If you use a doctor example, you'd have blood pressure, cholesterol, heart rate, all those observations that a nurse would be doing. And then BMI, which I keep doing and failing. So I wonder about that BMI measurement. But it certainly is a challenge as I step on those scales and I get another report that I should be leaner. But anyhow, moving over to the next slide, KPIs is all about keeping it real. And honestly, you can end up, and you see there the first letter of each blue section there is ICE. You identify everything measurable, you collect and report on everything, and you know what? You just end up with so much data that you can't work out what you're doing anyway. So the whole point of this is to actually drill down on those operational data points that help you manage the practice in a better way. And as accountants, we're always drilling into lots and lots of data, but in reality, there are a few key ones that you can manage a medical practice on one page. And we have an example of that later on. So another great way of thinking about KPIs is on the next slide, is how well are we managing our budget versus have we met our budget? So when you start thinking about the way you're using your terminology within your teams, have we met our budget? It's a very negative outcome and not a very open question. So you're just going to get, we're under budget, we're over budget. But if you're asking a question more like, how well are we managing our budget? Then you'll benefit from the fact that people will be thinking about what was in the budget, what's driving it, what do they have done well, what could be improved. And those styles of questioning and more open-ended questioning engage the team. So a KPI is then being used to help promote and manage the practice rather than rule and dictate to the practice. So coming on to the next slide is our strategic objectives. And what are they? Is it employer of choice? Is it excellent patient care? Is it a practice of choice for doctors? Is it one their registrars are lining up to get in? Well, all of those things can be your strategic objective, and utilizing a balanced scorecard helps us drill down and align that strategic objective into 4 key areas as detailed on the next slide. So what we have here on this is our vision and strategy is the central hub to our practice. That's what we really need to understand. I can tell you inside our firm, our vision and strategy is up on the wall on every floor in every building of Cutcher and Neal. We call it our strategy on a page. It's right there. It embodies every part of our firm. And even in induction, our vision and strategy is getting reiterated to new employees. In our workplace posts, we're always aligning our strategy to some of the outcomes. So the purpose of the balanced scorecard, as you can see here, is to align that strategy to financial outcomes, to internal processes, to learning and growth, and from the patient perspective, so that we're looking at a holistic view of our practice and how to get those KPIs really to help us manage our practice better. On the next slide is a few examples. So our vision and strategy might be world-class standards. It might be employer of choice. And let me tell you, nominating for an award is well worth doing, particularly if you put the hard yards in, because there's nothing better than external justification or ratification of your standards or being a great employer, because it's not often that someone actually says, okay, well, Cutcher-Neal, you're a great employer, but where do we actually get that written down? So awards are a great way of achieving that. And excellent patient care has to be at the forefront of every medical practice, I would imagine. On the next slide, the financial ones. And yes, you are talking to an accountant, so you could get oodles of these ones. Inside our firm, there could have been debtors days, average fees, net profit, gross profit, budgets, full-time equivalents. But it might be as simple as we want to grow our revenue by improving our productivity. But in productivity also links to capacity. So it becomes very important we understand what productivity and capacity really mean within the practice. On the next slide, we talk about the patient perspective. So it might be improving our reputation, increase patient satisfaction. I even think just waitlist. My daughter had to have a CT scan yesterday, and trying to get in to see a specialist is very difficult. And so it was a 3-month wait. Lucky I had some clients in Cutcher-Neal to help me along, but once again, that might be one of the key performance indicators that you want to do. On the next slide is about internal processes, and it's certainly advanced PracticeHub will help there and improve productivity. We could be looking at patient waiting time. We can look at resource utilization. I even think just simple task management from an employee perspective is an incredible tool. And you'll see some demonstrations of that further on in this presentation. And the last part to our balanced scorecard is about learning and growth. And so talking about our employees, our business software. So I guess the whole of the world has had a massive move to cloud in the last 18 months. Thankfully, our firm had moved earlier, but cloud certainly offers you a huge amount of different styles of software that you can be using. And the integrations that are coming now are quite amazing with Xero and Surgical Partners and Cubico and KPIs, just to name a few, that can help really empower your practice and get rid of some of those menial tasks that were just taking information from one screen and putting it onto another. So certainly very important. Probably at this point, it'd be very worthwhile for me to hand over to David, who can drill down on some of those KPI questions and take it further of his insight into running medical practices.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. It's really important as we go through this webinar talking about empowering practice managers and practice owners to recognise the important relationship between accountants and the management staff of medical businesses. It's really important to have a close relationship to someone like Jared to help guide through the interpretation of these types of things. And the balanced scorecard is a really important way to keep a track of things. We work as management consultants to hundreds of practices around Australia, and we routinely go through this sort of discussion in between the activation of PracticeHub and the use of practice managers' relationship with their accountants. The key performance questions that we ask when creating that scorecard, and let's be frank, the scorecard often looks like an Excel spreadsheet. In fact, it's often an Excel spreadsheet, and that's where your data can be tracked week on week or month on month. We want to make sure that each one of these questions I'm going to go through now is linked to the strategy, that it uses easily available and relevant data, and it looks forward rather than looking back. We want to aim towards the goal of the practice and fulfill a strategy rather than critique what might have happened 6 or 8 months ago. So let's have a look at, first we'll hit some of the financial KPIs. The next slide. So on the balanced scorecard, first we're going to look at setting up your spreadsheet that's going to talk about financial metrics. Pretty easy to do, particularly if you've written a budget. If you don't have a budget, you should have at least something written down about what the plan of what the practice is going to generate over the next period, whether that's fortnightly, monthly, or quarterly. And then tracking that over time will give you a perspective of how close you are to reaching your strategic goal or the business plan that is in place. This can also be measured as gross income, and of course should have some component in there of expenses as well. And an easy way to interpret that maybe is the percentage analysis. So what percentage of our revenue have we generated this month compared to what we budgeted for? What percentage of our expenses have we spent this month compared to what we budgeted for? That's easy to track and a relevant number, because the outcome of this sort of KPI will then help you determine what to do in the next period of time, whether it's the next month or the next quarter, adjusting your team, your expenses, or trying to adjust some of the other levers you have in the business to increase revenue. Let's go to the next slide, Anna Maria. Another way to look at the finances inside your business and to have on that Excel spreadsheet is a measure of gross profit or net profit. Obviously, gross profit is just the fees generated from the business minus the direct costs. Nice measure of how the business is going and something relevant to talk to the accountant about for tracking this. Easy number for the directors to understand as well, the directors of the business, because if there's going to be distributions to the directors, it's going to be impacted particularly by this sort of number. And that might engage the directors or the owners to make some decisions around that. If you drill down a bit more granularly about how you generate money within the practice, looking at how much money a session for a doctor or an allied health practitioner makes is important. And one simple metric of that might be the total number of patient fees compared to the number of consultations. So what is every single patient on average worth to the practice when they walk in? Now that sort of KPI will help you understand about pricing and compare against some of the other ones we'll look at when we talk about staff costs. Pretty easy to do as well with routine reports that come out of most medical practice softwares. Let's go to the next one, Anna Maria. The important way of losing money is accumulating debtors. And if you're not tracking debtors, then you are missing out on revenue, disrupting cash flow, and making it really difficult for your end of year accounting. A typical way to keep track of it using a KPI would look at the number of debtors that are out to 30 days, 60 days, or 90 plus days. Generally, anything that's out to 90 plus days is going to be very hard to recover. So it's effectively money lost. So if you're seeing the times that the reports go out and tracking that, then you can respond and spend more administration time on following up debtors. Let's have a look at the next one, Anna Maria, as we go to the patient perspective. So we've spoken about the financial KPIs. We can track various components of how the business is going. Let's think about how the business appears to the patients and the patient experience. Now, the reputation of the practice is important because that's going to attract patients. And that might be assessed by following the referral source. How many different doctors are referring to the practice? Are they coming from different areas geographically, or are they coming from different specialties or different allied health services? And then also looking at the patient mix. Are you attracting patients that are more likely concession holders, or attracting patients that live outside of the normal catchment area? Are you attracting certain demographics from within the community? And is that part of your strategic goal? If it's not meeting the strategic goal, then you get to track this and change your management accordingly. Market share is really important, particularly for primary health services like general practices. So I think we've got a practice manager there from Newcastle. At least think about your area of Newcastle. Do you know the demographics and the patients in your catchment area, the total number? And can you calculate what proportion of that local area have you attracted as patients? So that might simply be the count of new patients that have come in that you can track in your practice management software, or it might be dividing that by the denominator of how many people live in the local area. Again, an easy metric to follow and something that informs how you're tracking on the way to your strategy. Let's go to the next slide, Anna Maria. We're still on patient perspective, and back to that, how does a patient perceive the practice? Let's think about patient satisfaction. Well, for primary health and in GP land, we need to have a patient satisfaction survey. So let's have a metric that we can track easily. It might be a 5-point scale of how satisfied the patient is with their experience. Another way to derive that sort of insight might be the number of patients that do not arrive for their booked appointment, or the number of complaints that come in. The important thing is here is if it's on your balanced scorecard and you're tracking it over time, you can see improvement or deterioration in these numbers. that can help inform proactive, forward-looking management decisions for the business. Let's go to the next slide, Anna Maria. So internal processes are something that we do in our gap analyses. We work with a lot of practice managers to have a look at how effective and efficient teams are. For very busy practices, this can be hard to do and easy to have an objective vision. And often at the end of the day, we'll come up with these kind of KPIs for practice managers to track over time. We have what we call the Louise ratio, and this particularly is for specialist medicine, where a really good secretary, let's call her Louise, she is a real person, best secretary in the world, she can look after 6 consulting sessions in 1 full-time week. So if your practice is having, if your secretaries are accounting for less than 1.2 half-day sessions per day, then they're not working efficiently enough, or the systems you have in place aren't effective enough. So really dividing the number of consulting sessions by the number of staff will give you this ratio, and the magic number is 1.2 sessions per staff member per day. Another way to look at it might be taking the overall administration cost, so your payroll for administration staff, and dividing that per consulting session or per patient. And those ratios can be tracked over time to hit a predefined target, and the benchmark that you should have as admin cost per session or per patient will vary according to what type of practice you have. It can always be reduced with an improvement in efficiency and software utilization. Allied health staff are an important cost for practices, particularly for multidisciplinary practices. So looking at the number of nurse hours and how they're utilized, or in the ophthalmology practices that are represented in this audience, how often are the orthoptists used and what are they generating in terms of revenue? Tracking that over time, again, can help with your forward planning. Let's have a look at the next slide, Anna Maria. Another way to look at internal processes and efficiency is the people generating most of the revenue for most medical practices, and that can be looked at revenue per hour or revenue per session for doctors. What's most relevant for your practice might be one of those. And real estate is the second biggest cost to a practice after staff. So looking at room occupancy, and everything might be great, but if you're only using 40% of your room capacity, then there's a great potential to grow the practice, which will require adjustment of the strategy and a growth strategy as well. Let's go to the next page, Anna Maria. And this sort of tracks the processes of the patient journey, starting from how long is the wait list as a measure of success or a trigger for growth. How's the patient accessing the practice? Is it through online or telephone booking? We track that over time. Online bookings are cheaper for the practice than telephone bookings, so can we pull some levers to improve online bookings? The time in the waiting room and cancel appointments are other derived factors that can come out of the practice software and easy to follow. Let's go to the next slide, Anna Maria. This is really important because practice management time is expensive and highly sought after from the patients, from the doctors, from the other admin staff. And one metric we would almost always put in place is keeping a track of how much time a practice manager is spending on bookkeeping. Pretty easy to track number of hours per week. And certainly if the number of hours is tracking to 3, 4, 5 hours per week, almost always it's going to be cheaper and more efficient for the practice manager and the practice to outsource the bookkeeping to an agency. Same with payroll and same with front desk duties. How many hours are your nurses and your practice managers spending on the front desk? Is there a cheaper alternative? The answer is always yes. So tracking that metric can help make decisions in a very effective way. And if a practice manager has been effective, there will be ongoing professional development reviews, and that's an easy way to track the engagement of the practice manager with the staff. I think they wouldn't look out of place on a balanced scorecard that's reviewed by the owners or practice manager every fortnight or every month or every quarter. Let's go to the last couple of slides that I have, Anna Maria. So thinking about learning and growth, employees really help us express the culture of the business. So making sure that staff are engaged is a really important and challenging part of managing practices. Simply the number of employees or headcount can be important. the experience of the employees, what's the average amount of time they've been in the practice. That's something you might track every 6 months or a year. If you find that you're losing experienced staff, that might need some change. The engagement in training and an assessment of capabilities would be important on a periodic scale to measure that, to make sure that you are able to meet the needs or expected needs of the practice, and to see having a balanced scorecard approach to, are the staff right for the job? Do they actually fill the position descriptions that they're set with? Again, an easy way to check whether or not we're being effective as managers and getting the most value for the money that we have out of employees. Let's go to the last slide, I think it is. Measuring the effectiveness of the IT system is super important. So utilization here. If staff are not utilizing software, then you're not getting the benefits of the system. We're about to see a demonstration of PracticeHub, really important component of managing a practice from Hoxton's perspective, and really a core requirement, I think, to get the best out of optimization and efficiency. If it's not being used, then it's not as good as it could be. So tracking that over time, tracking breaches or security breaches or downtime might be important for your practice as well. And I think I have one more slide, Anna Maria. No, so Jared's then going to take us through what the scorecard might physically look like, but we've just seen some examples of some pretty easy to measure metrics, which will make a really compelling storyline for your practice. And think of your own examples of those sort of things that can help the owners and the directors adjust the business settings to achieve the goals of the business.
Okay, thank you, David. Actually, we've just got one interesting question, which would relate back to one of the KPIs you were mentioning earlier from a lady who said, for gross profit, shouldn't we be using service fee income as opposed to medical fees? And so my initial thoughts on that is that you could have different doctors on different service fee rates. So that will distort your percentage analysis and your ultimate net profit as a percentage of revenue. So when we look at a Cutcher & Neal, we unpack the practice structure and track gross medical fees first, then what the doctor is earning, which may be a percentage of that, and then arriving at a gross profit, so that as you look at your profit and loss more holistically, you can see the key driver of patient revenue. Some simple tools. I think it's great to go through some theory, but here's some really simple outcomes that we've seen in our practices and that may help you. And you can notice there that I've got them color coded in the colors of the balanced scorecard that we went through before. So moving to the next slide, I like this one. This was my last skin checkup. And if you look on the picture there, you can see a very simple KPI being deployed at reception. And what their target was that 80% of people who saw their doctors rebooked for the next year for their next checkup. And you could see that very clearly that the staff were monitoring that on a daily basis and having, I think on the Tuesday, they were 83% and 80% the following day. So once again, that patient capacity rebooking process is making sure that all the patients are well cared for, and also it's actually helping alleviate time of nursing staff and doctor staff because reception are well trained on what needs to happen with those checkups. And it was funny, I did ask if I could take that photo. The next slide is a bit of a template. We'll actually send that out to you, so we don't need to really focus too much on it right now. But I think the important point of this template, it's outlining that identifying what the objective of your KPI is and who's asking the question and what information are they going to do with the answer. So once they get the answer out of the KPI, also, how do I find the data? And then how do I benchmark it? What do I check the value against? And when do I report it? So a very good template to make something complicated a lot easier. And also, if you remember my earlier slide, don't end up with ice. With too much information and ending up lost. On the next slide is really what I'm trying to show you here is that we break up our profit and losses between direct costs, administration, employment costs, and premises and equipment. And there's a big reason behind that. We all start out with a profit and loss in alphabetical order, but really you just end up with a whole lot of accounts. And sometimes we end up with charts of accounts with 200 different lines in them. And so there's so much time being spent analysing the detail that we can't see the forest for the trees. So on the next slide, I've got a very simple example of what we would do. This is a template chart of accounts put through every medical practice on Xero at Cutcher & Neal. And the whole point there is get rid of all those lengthy, long accounts. Who wants to break up bank charges? My goodness. And then you can see it's alphabetical. You can see the fuel costs are being broken up. There is just so much information on the left-hand side that realistically, you can drill down in an account in accounting software these days. It's not like the days of old where it was very difficult to get the micro information from the macro picture. So on the other side, I've got their direct costs allocating out our medical and orientated staff and medical supplies, all of our admin style costs, and then our cost of employment. And I think that's a really important one, tracking employment costs. And as to that question that we were asked earlier about reporting service fee income or gross medical fees, well, I generally track employment costs against gross medical fees. A really simple example, we may say that it's about 20% of gross medical fees for a GP practice. I know some corporates target 15% in employment costs. So they're obviously looking for an efficiency point that's different inside a corporate practice to, say, the local one. And again, down the bottom, premises and equipment. So how is the rent tracking and our costs? At the moment, all premises and equipment are all spiking because we've got that instant asset write-off happening. And it's really, it's pushing big depreciation back through profit and losses. So, but at the same time, we know the reason for it. So once a very boring chart of accounts, it actually turns into something that becomes quite manageable and provides good information. And that's where the next slide really cuts in. And so you don't have to worry about the Simpsons, Bart, Lisa, and Homer and Marge, but what are we doing here? We're just trying to understand what Bart's up to. Bart was supposed to have billed $28,000 for that month, but instead has only hit $20,000. Now, is that a factor of Bart not having too many cancellations, too many no-shows, or not being able to use the practice nurse, or missing out on a bulk billing incentive on a bulk billing patient? We don't actually know that detail, but straight from that simple budget versus actual, we're already starting to think more deeply about the doctor and maybe what we need to do to help them to be more effective and efficient with their patient base. It's not about billing the patient more, it's about being effective with how we're billing the patient. On the next graph down about income and expenses, and as I mentioned before, the key point about that was not making it too hard to look at. So on this slide, you can see that our fees were slightly under. That's thanks largely to Bart and Homer. They must have been misbehaving. But our direct costs are about line ball. But when you look down on the graph below, I like the differential graph. So when I start to look at this practice, very quickly, I know revenue's out. So then I go back up to the top graph. Okay, it's Bart and Homer I need to be talking to. Oh, and my employment costs are blown out in that month. Well, then I can go back, I can look at my employment costs in my profit and loss and start to understand really what's happening there. So for me, that's a really simple one-page snapshot on where we're at. In fact, that's one that we use very regularly across a lot of our medical practices. And we had one other page on the back of it, which has a lot to do with full-time equivalents. And as David had mentioned earlier, staffing is your biggest cost of being in practice, and the next one is your rent. So once you start to understand deeper metrics on your staff, then you can gain greater insight into how to run your practice. So we'll move to the next slide. So looking again on internally, I think doctor available hours is one that's always important to me, and a target staff ratio and our rostering. And where you learn the most is by practical experience. And one of our practices was profitable for 20 years. And one of my partners retired. I took over the reins, and their first year they had a loss. And I went, oh, what have I done? I've only been on the job for a year. But what had actually happened was our practice manager had become complacent, and so were our doctors. So we were staffing up our practice to have doctors there who would turn up an hour after the doors were open. So there'd be people there half an hour before opening, an hour waiting, patients are in the waiting room getting frustrated. Any wonder they were losing money. Just the simple metrics of aligning the roster right and having our staffing right and making sure the doctors value the time that the admin and support staff are there, because realistically, they can have a pretty profound impact in a medical practice of just not monitoring and being there on time. On the next one is my example of a time budget. Now, we won't drill down to that today, but what we do in some of our practices is, and you can see this is done in Excel, I can't seem to find a way around it, but basically what we're trying to understand is, well, if we've got this many doctors and we have this many working days per month, take out our annual leave, work out how many hours per day they have to use, and then that turns out into a month, and then we track backwards and have a look at our average consultation time. So that's not saying cut your consultations by 5 minutes. That's saying, well, our average consultation for this particular doctor might be 21 minutes. So when you're thinking about that revenue budget and the graph I showed you with Bart and Homer, that might be the reason. Maybe they didn't have enough support and were understaffed and they had a lot of admin to do and they couldn't see as many patients. So that gives us a budget number of consultations and gives us an average fee. And we always put a productivity in to allow for some admin. And all of a sudden we've got something real to project forward with and to start thinking about the balance of our practice, because we can understand where our doctor is and what revenue we can expect to get from them. On the next slide, again, the Simpsons are having a field day with us, and we've got Dr. Bart, Marge and Homer. And earlier on, David mentioned a admin and support staff ratio of 1.2 per session. So if I do the maths right, that's 2 sessions a day, it's 2.4 staff in full-time equivalents per doctor. So if I'm looking at what I have here, and it doesn't matter that I've picked 1.5 as a target ratio, this is just to demonstrate how you could do something really simple on a roster over a week. And I'll tell you what, this gives you incredible insight into your practice. We're not using it to manipulate anything, we're just using it to understand how we rostered our staff's hours against our available doctor hours. And if you really drill down and have a look, maybe we pick on Friday and we have a look at Wednesday. Both days have 20 hours of doctor time, yet on one day, we've got 40 hours of staff time, so being a ratio of 2 hours per 1 hour of doctor time, whereas Wednesday was 1.6. So very, very carefully there, we need to make sure, what do we do on Friday that was different to Wednesday? And that can come back to your practice manager and rostering. And to round it out, I do like this one, internal tasks. We use something similar inside our firm. It's a great way to measure tasks getting done with inside your practice, right in front of you in PracticeHub. So I think that's one that Anna Maria will talk a lot more about in the part of her presentation. So thank you for your time thus far.
That's fantastic. Thank you both to Jared and to David. I think it's a really nice mix of Jared's accounting experience and David's medical experience, sort of bringing the two views to this balanced scorecard approach. So the next thing we're going to look at is a demonstration of PracticeHub, and it's particularly going to focus on some things that we've talked about. So it isn't by any means a comprehensive review of the platform, but it certainly gives you a taste in terms of how the balanced scorecard things we've been looking at can be incorporated into PracticeHub. All right, let me find my notes here. Okay. All right, so first thing, I guess, what you're seeing there is the dashboard. And the dashboard, I think, is a great way of showing your internal processes. Apologies for the stumbling chat here. Okay, so the dashboard is an excellent way of seeing your internal processes in action. So, we talked about tasks, we talked about, training, learning and growth, all those sorts of things. So it's a very good way of showing that. Some of the other things that David and Jared touched on were in the balanced scorecard were around strategic objectives, mission and strategy. And so think one of the important things in that is that those things are best kept out in the open so that everyone understands. So Jared, you made the comment there that, you know, these things are up on the walls, that new staff are inducted, they're told about these things. So I tend to think, you know, it's really important to have this stuff clear and to make it visible and transparent to everyone so that everyone understands what that goal is for the whole practice. And, you know, things like the employer of choice, excellence in patient care can all be covered in this sort of information that is clearly visible. One of the other things we talked about was patient perspective. So that can encompass things like, you know, reputation management, use of social media, those sorts of things. So from a PracticeHub point of view, I'd be thinking about things like your social media policy in terms of for the practice, but also for the individual members of the team as well. So, you know, what does our policy around use of social media and how we share that with our team. So again, from the point of view of ensuring that people are aware of these balanced scorecard items, this is a great way to share that information, but also for you as managers and owners of the practice to have a simple process where you can get people to acknowledge that they've read and understood this information again. And in this instance, for example, you can see we've added a link to the RACGP's guide for the use of social media. That's a really good resource. So it really backs up the why we do what we do and that we're complying and doing things correctly. Also, I think to highlight, you know, one of the important things around internal processes is getting the whole team involved. And whilst you may not want everybody in here being able to make changes and update policies, you do want people to be able to flag when they've picked something up, and it becomes much more of a team document. It's more of a living document as well. So I've had a contribution from another user who said, what about instant messaging? It's not referenced in this policy. And I can go back and give them feedback as the manager or the owner saying that's a really good point. You know, technology moves on so quickly. Thanks for picking that up. We'll update the policy accordingly. So it very much becomes this sort of living document that the whole team is engaged in and part of your internal processes, that you can set KPIs even for the use of the manual. And I think that's a really important thing, you know, have some KPIs. I know we have clients who do set KPIs and they monitor the usage of the manual, tracking people's acknowledgement of policies, completing training modules, all those sorts of things. In terms of improved reputation, I suppose some of the other things, you know, that we've talked about is things like waiting times and appointments and that sort of thing. So, you know, if you've got your policy and procedures around appointment management, that's really powerful as well. So, you know, are we booking the correct type of appointments? You know, what happens when the patient cancels or changes their appointment? What do we do about walk-ins? Urgent access, which of course then leads to triage and those sorts of things. What is covered under the different appointment types? Having that information there means that you've got consistent systems around managing your patients. So internal processes, which in turn then give a much better patient experience. The other item I'd probably highlight on here relating to that improved reputation is a quality register. So one of the things, and it's really simple, you know, Jared, you mentioned about, you know, an Excel spreadsheet. Sometimes the simplest solutions just work really well. So things like your quality improvement register, again, making that visible, and it becomes part of that culture of the practice of saying, you know, we need to think about when something happens. If we have an incident, what are we going to change? How are we improving our quality to minimize that risk, but also how we're improving our practice? So keeping track of these things, you know, the patients reported a lack of seating, somebody slipped on a wet floor. What have you done to improve your quality and hence your reputation with your patients as well? Another part of the patient perspective was increasing that patient services. And once again, you know, if you can have a framework already around your policies and procedures for appointment management and those sorts of things, you can easily integrate information relating to these new services that you're planning to implement as well. So, it'll come down to, the booking process, delivering those services, the credentials of the people required to deliver those services, what's the billing process for those sorts of things. So again, having this framework to document and clearly share that information is really valuable. From the point of view of patient satisfaction, again, a compliments register, I think, is very powerful. It's a good way of being able to say, okay, what did people like about what we've done? Gives you an indication of where maybe you can continue to add value. So we do have complaints, but you can also have your compliments register. So, somebody thanked the staff member for looking after their cranky, tired toddler, and things like that. So these are important things. And again, I think they reinforce that culture within the organisation as well. You can also, out of these, have your action plans. So if you do, particularly I know in general practice, when you do your accreditation survey, if you have an action plan that comes out of the survey results, you can start to incorporate those into these registers as well. One of the other things that I know was mentioned was around position descriptions. And I know it was a really, really good point around, you can see I'm giving you the full tour of the search just within the manual here. So very important around having position descriptions that actually do reflect what people's actual roles are. And so whilst, we've got a policy around, we have these position descriptions, you can also attach them to the page so people can go and say, okay, we've got a medical practice assistant. What is their role? What are the actual duties they need to do? And you can set review dates. So maybe it's like, we really are going to implement a system where we're going to review our job descriptions on a regular basis every 12 months, or when we recruit a new staff member. We can just go through and make sure that what we're recruiting for is reflected in that job description. We've talked about appointment management, and then the other item that was raised as part of internal processes was around surgery hygiene. And if anything, the last 15 months or so have really highlighted is the importance of being prepared for infection control and pandemic requirements. So within our PracticeHub platform, you can have all your policies and procedures relating to your infection control policies around, and that's probably just giving me a short version. Let me show you the full version. So you can see here, there's about the practice team, so staff immunisations, those sorts of things, use of PPE, and then also around your equipment register. So making sure that your equipment is maintained, that you've got a system in place for ensuring that those items are serviced appropriately, calibrated, certifications all completed as required. So for example, with my steriliser, I can clearly see, what it is, where it's located. It's a bit like an asset register, a maintenance scheduler, and a document storage function all in one place. And really simple. All of the documentation relating to this item can be easily linked, and it can all be easily searched for and retrieved as necessary. The last item there was around learning and growth. So you did see earlier when I showed you the policy that required the staff member to sign off on it, that they'd read and understood. So again, that's part of your process of ensuring that people are understanding the processes. But one of the other things that I think is really important, and I often use the example of how many of us have things like PayPal and Facebook, and they say, do you accept the terms and conditions? Have you understood? And we all click yes. And sometimes if people do that, you kind of have that sense of, but did they really understand? So somebody may sign off on a policy around your privacy and confidentiality. Did they really understand? Wouldn't it be nice to have some evidence of that understanding? So within the PracticeHub system, we've got a range of learning modules where you can go in and sort of work through these learning outcomes. So in the case of privacy, we talk about the privacy principles, the practice environment, IT security, and that sort of thing. I think these are really terrific to do as part of a group training. Often adult learners like to relate what they're learning to their real life environment. So you could have a a discussion around this sort of, remember when that father came in and wanted to see his 16-year-old daughter's medical records? How did we handle that? What do we know from having gone through this training module? The great thing is at the end, there is a quiz. So I talked just before about having evidence of understanding. The user needs to complete a quiz, and you've got that peace of mind. If they've scored 80% or more, they pass, and you've got that peace of mind that when they said they'd read and understood that policy, you have some evidence of that understanding itself. I think the other thing too is it gives the team a sense that you're investing in their growth and in their development as well. So I think that that's a very important factor in there as well. One of the other things from the point of view of learning and growth is that culture. And one of the things that we like to encourage practices using PracticeHub to do is do things like upload meeting minutes. So if you have regular practice meetings, you can go through and upload these. And especially in an environment where there are lots of casual and part-time staff, it's a great way to make sure that the people who are unable to attend the meetings still have access to the information. They don't feel they're out of the loop and they're missing out, and they're not coming back to you with the "I wasn't told" or "I didn't know about that." So very much a case of, making that information visible and easy for their people to access when they need to. As well. So certainly I think it reinforces that culture of transparency and openness as well. And probably, as I keep an eye on the time here, the last thing, just a reminder in terms of leadership, which was another aspect of learning and growth, was linking a bit to position descriptions. Was talking about roles and responsibilities. So whilst you're doing your roster and sort of having your staff and the key roles, I think it's also important to understand what each of those roles need to be able to do. And it also makes it really clear for the rest of the team around who's responsible, who's taking the lead on different aspects of the practice, different areas of the practice as well. So just circling back to the dashboard, as I said at the start, this sort of summarizes everything that's going on. Your regular user has a much simpler dashboard. They basically they see what they need. So it's very much, I think we're all awash with so much information lately that too much information can be hard, but for your regular normal user, they have a much simpler view as well. But again, the information they need is very easily accessible for them. So that brings me to the end of my demonstration of PracticeHub. So I might just quickly check and see if we've had any other questions while I've been talking.
Anna Maria, that's a fabulous demonstration of some of the day-to-day activities and regular scheduled activities that a practice manager would be doing within PracticeHub. One of the things that we work with practice managers to do is to set up a routine of going through some of those workflows that you've just said, checking on what people have ticked off and signed off within PracticeHub, and scheduling the calculation and reporting of the KPIs. So a business owner or practice principal should require at least a monthly update on the business, and so they can keep an idea on the metrics. Now, every KPI doesn't need to be reported every 4 weeks, but with that sort of frequency, at least the practice manager understands how things are going and tracking for proactive management, but also reflection on how we're going on the pathway to the strategic goal.
Excellent. Good point, David. Thank you. Some next steps. If you're already a PracticeHub client and you want to know about implementing some of these balanced scorecard areas into your PracticeHub site, the KPIs in particular, please contact our team. And if you're not a PracticeHub client, please visit our website where you'll find out more about the benefits and all the features. Because as I said, it was a very sort of streamlined view that you saw today. And you can contact us via phone, email, or visit our website. As I mentioned Also at the beginning, there will be a recording of the webinar sent out to you. Keep an eye out for our upcoming webinars as well. And if you have some feedback, we'd really appreciate it. So please complete the survey at the end. Jared or David, any final comments before we wrap up? I particularly want to thank you both for your time and for the insights and the information you've given our attendees today. Hopefully, if they're anything like me, they were madly scribbling things down, because all of these things give us good ideas.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to present to Anna Maria. I really enjoyed putting the overview together and listening to David's, I guess, on the ground insights into medical practices, and then rounding it out with such a comprehensive piece of software with PracticeHub. It certainly means that there's probably, in a GP land, I imagine, no excuse for not being able to get through accreditation with such an awesome tool. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks for having me as well. I would like to reiterate to the practice managers out there that expert help through PracticeHub, through your local accountant or your practice manager advisor, helps plug in some of the gaps. If you've recognised you're not meeting the ideal that we've described, help from any one of the sources can help you get over the line and improve your management capabilities.
Excellent. Thank you all, and thank you very much to our attendees, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.